We're in Numbers chapter 34. Numbers chapter 34 is where we'll be biblically. In your outlines, it's lesson 13. Billy just ran down. I have a handful of those in my hands. If you want one of those, I'll be glad to give it to you. Just raise your hand. Billy just ran downstairs to grab a few more, but you won't need it. I'm giving it to you, but you won't need it. I mean, you can have it, but you won't need it. It's a very limited use tonight. I'll show it to you on the screen on the handful of occasions. The only reason I'll probably look at it is because there are a couple of questions involved in it, and since people take those home and answer those questions, I like to at least stop and answer those questions. But otherwise, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. But Billy did run down to grab. I just sent down another 10 or so to the printer, and so he just ran down to grab those. So if you want them, it's perfectly well and good. And there he is. So raise your hand again if you'd like one, and he'll be glad to share it with you. After my big disclaimer, Billy, I don't think anybody's going to take you up on it. I found 3 or 4 up here too once he went down. Of course, then I make all that big statement, and then here in a minute I'll go, well, no, let's look at the lesson sheet. All right, sorry, I'm just trying to organize my screen here a little bit before I turn it on. We're talking about all of these issues as it relates to Moses leading the people out of Egypt towards the promised land. He didn't get to lead them all the way in. And one of the things that we were talking about on Sunday was the fact that Moses doesn't quit just because things didn't go well for him. He continues to help the people. He continues to lead them and provide education for them, if you will, and things that will assist them in heading into the promised land. One of the things, and we talked about Sunday, was they're going to need a new what or a new whom? New leader. We're going to have a new leader. And who does that become? That becomes Joshua. And there was a lot of legitimate reason for that. Number one, he was only one of 2 that what? Yeah, they gave a good report, and because of that, allowed him and Caleb to what? Go into the land, right? If you remember, there's a numbering of the people that happens at Sinai, and then there's a new numbering of the people after the 40-year wandering in the wilderness. Which one was larger? The first one, right? By a little bit. The first one was larger because we've waited for these 40 years to remove that one generation of fighting men anyway, before they head into the promised land. So there's been a new numbering of the people. There's this prepping in order for them to be able to go into the promised land. Joshua is going to be the new leader, and we talked a little bit about that at the end of our study last Sunday, that an issue comes up. And the issue comes up between 2.5 of the tribes and the rest of them. What was that issue? Well, let me rephrase it. Who were the 2.5? There you go. Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, right? What do they come and ask Moses to do? Yeah, let me stay over here, right? We're all the point is to go conquest the promised land, which is on the east side of Jordan. We're encamped just on the other side of Jordan, just across from Jericho. We'll get into that eventually in our studies. But they wanted to be able to stay over here on the east side where they'd kind of already settled. Remember, they've had 40 years or so to settle in. And so because of that, Moses is like, well, if I let you just stay over here, it's going to be what to the others? It's going to be a discouragement. If you don't have to go fight, you just kind of get land given to you, and you don't have to do anything in order to receive it, that could be a discouragement to the rest of them, and I'm not sure that's a good idea. What was the compromise? Yeah, you're going to go, and kind of 2 caveats, if you will. One, you're going to go where? You're on the front. And number 2, you're staying till when? Till we're done, right? It's not go over for an initial skirmish and then go, hey, we've done our job, and head back to your homes. It's basically go, fight from the front, and you're going to stay until it's finished, till the land's conquested. And so that's the agreement that is made. what's interesting, and that kind of leads us up to where we are in our study this evening, is that brings up a series in some ways. Series may be too big a word, but a handful of issues, questions that the people have as it regards the instructions and laws and guidelines that God has given before they ever even really have to deal with it or address it. And we'll see more about that as we move forward this evening. So we're in Numbers 34 in your Bibles. We're talking now about how before they ever even go, God's given them basically the outline of where the promised land is. What region are we dealing with, you might ask? And so God, before they ever go, outlines for them exactly where these boundaries are going to be. And if you look at Numbers chapter 34, you'll see that God and His instructions to them tells them the basic outline of what would be the promised land. He says, the land shall fall unto you for an inheritance there in verse 2. He says, your south quarter shall be from the wilderness of Zin along by the coast of Edom. Your south border shall be the outmost coast of the Salt Sea eastward. And your border shall turn from the south to the ascent of Akrabim, pass on to Zin. The going forth thereof shall be from the south to Kadesh Barnea, and shall go on to Hazeradar and pass on to Asmon. Now, a lot of these places, by the way, we don't know exactly where they are. Some of them we do. And so we can kind of get a sense of where this is, but not necessarily do we know where all of these are. That happened right even coming out of Egypt, because we have a place that's called Mara because of the what? The bitter water. Really don't know for sure where that is. Kind of have an idea, but don't really know. There's a place called Rephidim where some things occur, but we don't know exactly where that is. In fact, there's even some discussion about, do we know exactly where Mount Sinai is or was? And so geographically it's challenging because we don't necessarily know, in terms of the discussion here in Numbers 34, the places he's pointing out as the basic outline. We don't necessarily know exactly where those places are, but we have a general idea. And especially when you talk about the nations that are the boundaries or the landmarks, if you will, it helps. And so, looking at this map, he did mention a nation. Which one was it? He mentioned Edom, right? Down here to the south. And he talked about how this border was going to go along the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. So you've got this border that comes down and it's going to cross over, okay, here to the south, below Simeon. It's interesting, fast forwarding history a little bit. Simeon's got a land when they go in and conquest it, but during the divided kingdom period, he kind of what? Kind of disappears, right? He kind of disappears from the discussion. But all of them are going to get a piece of property. Ephraim's going to get some in the name of Joseph. Manasseh's going to get some in the name of Joseph. It's interesting. We sometimes say the Levites didn't what? Didn't get any, but that's not necessarily true. They just didn't get a specific single zone that was there. They were going to be given cities throughout, right? Throughout the region. The Levites, that way they would be the priests who would be disseminated among the people all around. So we're going to come southward here, as you can see here, down by Edom, and then work our way across eastward. And then notice, go back in the text, he says, you'll turn from the south, the ascent, pass on to Zin, read that, verse 5. The border shall fetch a compass from Asmon unto the river of Egypt, and the goings out of it shall be at the sea. And as for the western border, you shall even have the great sea for a border. This shall be your west border. So that's the simplest of them all, right? Because he basically says, as you move across from a certain area down here to the south, somewhere alongside Edom, as you work your way to the west, you're going to go to the sea. Which is which sea, by the way? It's Mediterranean. And your west border is just going to basically run along all the way along the seashore. Okay? As you work your way to the north. And then once you get to the north, then he says, The north border from the great sea ye shall point out for you Mount Or. From Mount Or you shall point out your border unto the entrance of Hamath, and the goings forth of the border shall be to Zedad, and the border shall go on to Ziphron, and the goings out of it shall be at Hazarnon. This shall be your north border. Basically, as we understand it, you can just it's not very wide across that region, but it basically, if you can see on my screen, I can blow that up maybe a little bit more for you. But from the sea here to the west, and just here, if you can see Laish on your screen, not very far till you get to that far eastern border before we start making our way south again, as it relates to that. Now, keep in mind, you see Manasseh there, but that's the portion that he's getting where? On the other side of Jordan. So when you see Manasseh here on to the east, that's the portion that he asked for to be able to keep. And so the borders of the promised land don't include that. What wasn't what God intended. God intended to give them that portion across the Jordan on the other side. Manasseh and Reuben and Gad's request is granted. But in essence, that's not really part of what God had originally promised to them. Now what's interesting, I'll stop on this northern border, and it's not quite on my map. You can see Damascus to the north up there. It's interesting. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 7, I believe. I think even your notes in your outlines mentions it. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 7, it actually says that the northern border would be as far as where? Euphrates River. Okay, Euphrates River is not even on our map. If we were using this map, it would be well to the north of Damascus. In fact, we got familiar with the Euphrates River during what? In modern times. Kind of modern times. Yeah, Iraq War. Those wars in the Middle East have kind of brought us into kind of familiarity with the Euphrates and the Tigris, which is just north of there. And because of more modern issues and situations that have come up, we've kind of visualized. So I say that to kind of remind you, that's where we're talking about here. Now, modern Israel is just a small little sliver down here now as it relates to even this map. But that's the region that we're dealing with. So then so Mediterranean to the west, down here by Edom, okay, and then across to kind of create that southern border. And then we've got to kind of come back down along the Jordan, again to the Dead Sea. And it mentions, I think Numbers chapter 34 mentions the sea. Let me see. He mentions the Salt Sea. We often call that the Dead Sea. But in verse 11 he says, and shall reach unto the side of the Sea of Chinnereth. We generally call that what? Sea of Galilee. Generally, we refer to that as the Sea of Galilee because that's basically what it's being called during the time of Jesus. Okay, and so generally speaking, when we speak of that sea, which is up here to the north, even on this map, it's called Chinnereth because we're dealing with this time period. But by the time Jesus comes on the scene, we generally speak of that as the Sea of Galilee. And in fact, much of the work and preaching and teaching of Jesus happens in and along and around the Sea of Galilee. Not a lot of the work of Jesus happens where you might think, which is where? Jerusalem. He spends some time there, and obviously his life will end there. But he spends much of his time up and around the Sea of Galilee as it relates to that, which was the Sea of Chinnereth as it relates. So you're going to come down the eastern side of that, and you're going to work your way southward until you meet up with this region down here again by the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea to finish those borders. But that's the basic outline. Now, why do you think, well, let me ask you this. Does Deuteronomy 1:7 says that promised land or that God had promised was going to go clear as far as the Euphrates? Did that ever happen? Yes. Under whom? Solomon. It takes till Solomon to get that far north, but the boundary does eventually reach there as it relates to conquest and to the land that God had promised His people, eventually that boundary does extend that far. And so what Deuteronomy 1:7 is kind of talking big picture. Numbers chapter 34 is talking about immediate picture of what these boundaries are going to look like when they go in to take the promised land. And we may talk more in the future, but two basic principles are going to govern how this land gets divided up among all these tribes. What are the two basic principles? Okay, so size of the tribes of one, right? So if there's only 10 of us, we don't need as much as 1,000. And so if there's 1,000 members of this tribe, and the numbers are much larger, I know that. 1,000 members of this group, 10 over here, you can't expect as much. And so you're going to have varying sizes in regions based on size. And then what was the other measure? How'd they choose the replacement of Judah? By lot. And I think if we look at some of these narratives, there's that imagery of this division happening in that fashion, where decisions about who gets which section, and not just size, but which areas, and which ones are potentially better than others, and those kinds of conversations. If you recall, Caleb wanted what? There was like this mountainous area that Caleb wanted, and he kind of fought for that, and then kind of had to remind Joshua, hey, remember you said I could have that, and in order to receive it. But the division of the land is interesting, the way it kind of unfolds. We're talking very generically right now in our study about just the general outline of what God had intended for them. And so question 7 said, consult a Bible atlas. Good job, you just did. So talking about those basic reasons. Then his attention in chapter, and again, and by the way, if you're new to the class, we're not this survey study. We're just surveying history in our study. And so we're not spending a lot of time on any one particular area. And yes, believe it or not, I'm covering one lesson per week. And it's a rarity for me, but Sunday and Wednesday is basically all we cover in one lesson. Numbers 35. We're going to have now, again, an education about cities of what? Cities of refuge. And the entire chapter, really, of chapter 35 is given over to a discussion about these cities of refuge and rules and regulations, guidelines, instructions as to how we're going to deal with a particular issue. And what is it? Okay, so taking of a life. On one side, you have what might be called, what we would often just simply call murder. The out and out taking of an innocent life on purpose, for lack of a better description. And then you have another characteristic that is accidental. And how do we handle that? And is there any place of refuge for somebody who accidentally takes the life of another? Go to Numbers chapter 35. Numbers chapter 35. And let's look at this for a few minutes. So, Moses still alive, still giving instruction to the people. And he tells them, they're near Jericho. He commands the children of Israel that they give unto the Levites of the inheritance of their possession cities to dwell in. And ye shall give also unto the Levites suburbs for the cities around about them. So before we talk about these cities of refuge, we also need to talk about the fact that the Levites were going to be given places to live throughout these tribes. And not just any place to live, but they were also going to have to be given what? Yeah, in and around the city. And the Levites suburbs for the cities round about them. The cities shall they have to dwell in, and the suburbs of them shall be for their cattle. That's important, by the way, to one of your questions coming up, if you noticed. And for their goods, and for all their beasts. And the suburbs of the cities which ye shall give unto the Levites shall reach from the wall of the city and outward 1,000 cubits round about. You shall measure from without the city on the east side 2,000 cubits, and on the south side 2,000 cubits, on the west side 2,000 cubits, on the north side 2,000 cubits, and the city shall be in the midst. This shall be to them the suburbs of the cities. Now, here's my question. Why do you think God's giving all these details about they get cities, they get the suburbs, and he even says the first 1,000 cubits will be for this purpose, and then you need to extend another 2,000 cubits in order to define what a suburb is. Why do that? Okay, there won't be any questions. So you resolve exactly what is God talking about. Well, I'm telling you what I'm talking about. So you've got those resolved. Well, let me ask you this. I'll be careful here, but there's family visiting. Which bedroom do you get, Danny, when you come to visit your mom? Because you'll know which is the favorite child. Right? Is it you, Randy? Right? Now, I'm kidding a little, but you understand what I'm saying. If you come in and so the Levite shows up, and you've been at war and you've possessed this land, and you say, go live over there. Well, I don't have any room for my cattle. I don't care. Go live over there. Well, I need a place for my beasts, my animals, and I've got to be able to sustain myself. And listen, the Lord only told us we had to give you a place to live. He didn't tell us that we had to give you 2,000. Oh, yes, He did. Yes, He did. He doesn't leave to guess what He really meant. And there's not going to be, at least shouldn't be, any squabble over what God intended for them to provide the Levites. You give them cities, and not just the city, but you give them areas in and around that place. The city will be in the midst, 2,000 cubits all the way around, north, south, east, and west, as the suburbs, and the 1,000 cubits from the inner part, as I'm understanding it, needs to be good enough to sustain livestock. Yeah. He's pretty specific. There's no, take the cot in the back room when it comes to finding places for the Levites to live. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah, and you see the math working that way as well. 18. If we take a standard, the general judgment is 18 inches per cubit. So you're talking about 1,500 feet of all around for the cattle and stuff, and then 3,000 feet out beyond the inner of the city. And there's how many? 5,200 feet to a mile? Is that right? Something like that. Well, give or take. Okay, give or take. I was close. Okay, give or close. But yeah, so about half a mile. No, that's what I'm driving at. We ain't, we Americans still like to think in feet and miles and things like that instead of that complicated 10 numbering system called the metric. But anyway, but so decent, right? Half a mile for suburbs, roughly, a little more actually, around, and then it's got to be good enough to take care of. So it's a decent piece of ground as it relates to these purposes. And then amongst these cities, 48 cities that they were going to receive, you were going to have how many of them were going to become then cities of refuge? 6. Okay, yeah, so 3 on the original intended side, in some senses, of the Jordan, over on the west side, and But since there's going to be this large number of people on the east side of Jordan as well, we're going to have 3 cities of refuge over there too. Now, why do you think that would be significant? Well, let me just ask the question, and I'll tell you why I'm thinking that way. Why do you think it's significant to have 3 on each side? Say it again. Okay, and that's yes. So it's accessible. No matter where you happen to be, you've got accessibility to that. Well, and that's the core reason why they're. Here's this protective reason, and just food for thought. So you're on the run, okay? I know this is really hard for most of you. Some of you can probably relate to this, but you're on the run, and you generally want to get where? You want it. I mean, in terms of distance, as far away as possible, right? As far away as possible. So if I'm being chased by somebody on the east side of the Jordan, I may want to try to what? I may want to try to get to the west side, or vice versa. Now again, I'm not saying, I'm just saying that I'm trying to think like somebody who's on a run, because I'd want to try to get as far away as possible. So there may be some of that involved. If I'm on this side, if I'm from Reuben on this side, I may be taken off over to Dan or somewhere, or wherever the 3 happen to be in relationship to those things. So you've got these cities of refuge, but they're intended for who? Okay. So verse 6, Numbers 35, verse 6. Among the cities which ye shall give unto the Levites, of those 48, there shall be 6 cities for refuge, which ye shall appoint for the manslayer, that he may flee thither, and to them ye shall add 42 cities. So 6 cities of refuge, 42 more cities that the Levites will have. There's the 48. And these manslayers, in some senses, are distinguished from whom? From the murderer. There is a difference from the purposeful slaying of another human being and that which was unawares. That's the word used in verse 11. Numbers 35, verse 11, he says, Then ye shall appoint you cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the slayer may flee thither, which killeth any person at I didn't intend for this. I was unawares or not on purpose. He's going to have a place to go, because there's going to be a whom. Yeah, there's going to be avengers of blood. And those come, and we'd have to go look at the other parts of the law to get that, but they're going to come from whom? The family, right? And does the family care how my family member was killed? No, they don't care, right? All they know is that my family member's life was taken away, and somebody's going to what? Somebody's going to pay for that. And somebody's going to pay for that. And so here's the guy. He wasn't his intent. It was an accident. And so now he's being chased, potentially by these avengers of blood who are seeking to bring judgment against him. Of these cities, verse 13, which ye shall give, 6 cities shall ye have for refuge. 3 cities on the side of Jordan, and 3 cities shall you have in the land of Canaan, which shall be cities of refuge. Note verse 16. And if he smite him with an instrument of, speaking of the avenger, by the way, instrument of iron, so that he die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. If he smite him with throwing a stone, wherewith he may die, and he die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he smite him with an hand weapon of wood, wherewith he may die, and he die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. The revenger of blood himself shall slay the murderer. When he meeteth him, he shall slay him. But if he thrust him of hatred, or hurl at him by laying of weight, that he die, or in enmity smite him with his hand that he die. He that smote him shall surely be put to death, for he is a murderer, and the revenger of blood shall slay the murderer when he meeteth him. So, it's hard to follow in some ways. So, number one, he gives some very specific instructions to tell the difference between a manslayer, unawares, didn't mean to, unintentional, and a murderer. And he does that by a big, lengthy description of the kinds of things that might happen. But he warns the avenger of blood and says what? You better be what? You better be careful and think this through, because if you strike out in anger, now you've done what? Now you've murdered. If this is about anger, if this is with enmity, if this is about you just seeking personal retribution, God's governing the attitude of even the avenger of blood. God says it's right. It needs to be done. Life for life. God's very clear on that in relationship to His law for His people. But He even cautions the avenger of blood, be careful. If you're trying to set a bait and a trap and all the, if you encounter him and he's worthy of death, so be it. But if you're being manipulative and doing things in order to try to bait, if you're doing things that out of spite and anger and revenge, then you're going to be accountable for that. And I think there's tremendous wisdom in that, by the way. What did it take, by the way, to convict somebody? By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, right? So by a very limited number in some ways that it took in order to pronounce judgment against one. And so left to their own devices, man could easily run amok and just be out there, doing anything he can to seek revenge and vengeance against any and all that he deems it necessary. So you've got a legal system, if you will, that requires witnesses and evidence to determine whether somebody's a murderer or manslayer. Then there's restrictions and warnings given to the avenger of blood to make sure, number one, is this legitimately a murderer? Number 2, what's in your heart? And number 3, be careful of the devices you use to go about this, because judgment can come against you as well. So as harsh as life for life sounds, in some senses, as harsh as it sounds, the idea that your family members are allowed to go out and seek the consequence against the person who may have taken your life, God doesn't leave it to just arbitrary thinking. He's got a evidence system. He's got a control system. He does things within the law and instructions to be sure, if man will abide by his laws, to do it in the sense in the right way, and to be governed by that. Say it again, Bob. Yeah. It allows for a fair approach towards making these judgments as it relates to it. Any other questions, thoughts to that point? So, if you can make it to a city of refuge, then basically it's the obligation of whom, by the way? Because who's in these cities of refuge? Levites, right? So it's the Levites, because these cities of refuge are all governed and led by the Levites, and so it's their obligation to basically what? Yeah, determine truth, and if it's murder manslayer conversation, and also then if it's manslayer, their job is to protect you, to keep you away from the avenger of blood. And that safety net only is where? In the city. He basically tells them, if you keep reading, he basically tells them, listen, as long as you're in the city, then you're protected. But the minute you choose to go outside the city of refuge and that avenger of blood standing there, I can't help you, basically. You're going to have to stay there in that place until when? And that was one of your questions. Okay, until the high priest dies. High priest, he's high priest for all the people, but he's in charge of whom? It's not a trick question, by the way. So the high priest would be in charge of all the other priests, right? He's all the other priests, and all those other priests would be involved in these cities of refuge. And so when the high priest dies, they've basically honored their obligation to care for this person in their city of refuge under the government system, if you will, of that high priest. And when he dies, then he's to return to his own tribe. Well, I believe it's family. I believe it's kin, close kin, if you will. And so they're going to be the ones meeting out the judgment. That's why you got to have some, because you got to get past all that emotion when it's that. So quickly, your questions were 3 cities of refuge would be east of the Jordan, 3 west. Is that true or false? That was true. When would the manslayer be allowed to leave the city of refuge? Death of the high priest. And true, false, the Levites were to attend to worship and not own any cattle. That's false. How do we know that's false? Because they were given land to take care of that cattle. And so though their primary purpose in the kingdom would be to lead God's people as priests and handle those kinds of responsibilities, there was no restriction given to them as a whole as it relates to what they were allowed to own. Thoughts or questions about cities of refuge, manslayer, murder, things I missed? Go ahead, Mary. Yeah, I think he's talking about the whole, but they're all priests because it's you understand what I'm saying? Yeah, so it's yes, they're it's a in terms of evidencing those things, the congregation would come together as a whole. But generally, you would be led by the chief men of those places. So sometimes that term doesn't necessarily mean every man, woman, and child come out of their house and stood there and passed this judgment. It's more of a generic term in that sense. So we're about to head in, almost ready to start heading across Jordan, Jericho first, begin the conquest of the land. But interestingly, Manasseh comes up with a question. Before they ever are even being governed, before they're ever given a piece of property, Manasseh already has a what? He's already got a property question. before they're now keep in mind, he's already been dealing with some property issues because he's already formed what? He's got a region over here on the other side of Jordan, right? So he's got half of his tribe is already ready to settle, and they've kind of already got some property. So I don't think it's completely odd that Manasseh is the one, his tribe is the one that comes and raises a property question before they ever go into the promised land. Because they've already been kind of addressing property issues as they've kind of already settled themselves in some ways on the east side of the Jordan, because why else would they want to stay there if it wasn't conducive to the way they wanted to live and so it's not completely out of the ordinary for me anyway when I see this that it's them raising a property question, but it is an interesting question that they raise as it relates to property issues. In Numbers chapter 36, these men of the tribe of Manasseh, the chief fathers of the sons of the children of Gilead, Machir, the son of Manasseh, the families of Joseph. So they pointed all the way back to Joseph for us. They come near and speak to Moses before the princes and the chief fathers. And they said, the Lord commanded my Lord to give the land for an inheritance by lot to the children of Israel. And my Lord was commanded by the Lord to give the inheritance of Zelophehad, our brother, unto his daughter. So they were receiving inheritance by lot. And he said, the children, and my Lord, his father, was commanded by the Lord, who is God, to give the inheritance of Zelophehad, our brother, unto his daughters. If you look real quick at Numbers chapter 26, Numbers chapter 26 and in verse 33, you'll see the reference this fellow's making. In Numbers 26 and verse 33, and Zelophehad, that's the guy we're talking about, the son of Hephar, had no sons, but daughters. And the names of the daughters of Zelophehad were Mahlah, Noah, well, those guys, those wonderful young ladies. So it's an interesting moment, right? Because we're mostly through these sections, we're dealing with whom? Sons, the sons of Manasseh, the sons of Gilead, right? All the way through. But when we get to him, he doesn't have any sons. He got daughters. And they're included in the inheritance, right? They're included in receiving property. Now, because of that, Manasseh, who's part of this group, right? If you trace it all the way back, this family entity whose daughters are getting some of this property is part of this group. And they want to know, if they be married to any of the sons of the other tribes of the children of Israel, then shall their inheritance be taken from the inheritance of our fathers, and shall be put to the inheritance of the tribe whereunto they are received. So shall it be taken from the lot of our inheritance. And when the Jubilee of the children of Israel shall be, then shall their inheritance be put unto the inheritance of the tribe whereunto they are received. So shall their inheritance be taken away from the inheritance of the tribe of our fathers. Now, I'll be honest with you. My brain had, shocker, had trouble, because your mind thinks of Jubilee. Your mind might think, well, then the land should go where? Would have gone back, right? Anyways, that's the way my brain works. That okay, what's your concern here? Okay, so the land got transferred for a short period of time while they've been married to these girls, and so a guy from another tribe gets ownership of that property for a little period of time, but then the year of Jubilee comes around, and that's when everybody gets their stuff back. So either their description or understanding is wrong, my understanding is wrong, or all the above. But maybe it's just a misconception of what the year of Jubilee is about. You go back to Leviticus chapter 25, and that's where the instructions as it relates to the year of Jubilee was going to occur. And it happens, well, let's just go back and take a quick look. What time is it? We'll take the time to run back and look at this real quickly. So, he talks about sowing the field, right, for how long? 6 years, prune it for 6 years, do that. But then their 7th year comes and it's going to give it a what? Give it a rest. Give it a Sabbath as it relates to that. Then in verse 8, thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, and day of atonement shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout your land. You shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. So how is that going to be a problem in these guys' scenario in Numbers chapter 36? I'm just letting you talk. Yeah, I'm asking a little bit too. Right. Okay. Okay. And that 50-year mark. But again, I don't. They're thinking legalese even before they ever head into the promised land. Here's what I believe after racking my brain for a while. So so the girl gets married, right? She marries a man of another tribe. Well, you don't bring an excavator in and dig up the land that her father left her and carry it off to the other tribe. But where does she go? She goes to the other tribe. Okay? Now she's over here with this tribe, and she's most likely in that 50-year span going to have what? Children, an inheritance. Okay? But she's assimilated into this other tribe. Has rightful ownership of this property that's way back over here where she came from. And so most likely, and again, just thinking from Manasseh's standpoint, so for how many ever of those 50 years, what's somebody most likely been doing with that property back here? Yeah, been taking care of it, doing something with it, right? But 50-year hard, kids, and you have to you have to give that property to its rightful owner, which is over here in another tribe. That's what they're concerned about. Now, whether we consider that a legitimate concern or not, that's subject to opinion, right? Because the truth of the matter is, if I live way over here, if I'm from over here, let's just say I'm from down here in Simeon, right? Down here in the southern part of the Promised Land, and I married a girl from the northern part of Manasseh, on the other side of Jordan. What's that property mean to me? Not anything, right? Doesn't really mean anything to me. So the point may be moot, but it's a concern they have anyway. She goes off. We maintain possession of the land temporarily. But when the Jubilee year hits, my job is to restore everything to its rightful owner, and the rightful owner lives among a different tribe. And her inheritance and her family all live in a different tribe. And so it took me a while to kind of finally get my brain around that because my brain initially said, "No, wait a minute, Manasseh, what are you worried about? When the Jubilee year hits, they have to give it back to you. No, you have to give it to them because they're the rightful owner, and you've been using it for however long since she left. But she's the rightful owner, and it's going to have to be restored back to her. And so in that sense, they have a legitimate concern about the law. So, what's the answer before our time runs out? Okay, go ahead, Bob. Bell. Ask me Sunday. What's that? Yeah, I mean their question is completely futile if that's not if they can't. I don't think obviously they can. Yeah, obviously they can. Or God wasted our time, Manasseh wasted our time, everybody wasted our time, right? Because he's going to make laws governing it. So why make laws governing it if you have a law already that just said, because that would have been the answer. Well, but there are moments though where the land had already been given because they don't have any sons. In this case, there are no sons. And so what? And so there are going to be moments, obviously, where women did receive property because there were no sons to give it to. Yeah, that was the scenario here with this man. He didn't have any sons, and so in that sense, so that's how women became possessors of land. In that, and again, I would simply argue that if that wasn't a possibility, Moses, that's the quick answer, right? Manasseh, go home. You're asking a moot question because it can't happen because women aren't allowed to own property. That's your answer if that's the case. You understand what I mean? But that's not his answer. He gives them a lengthy description of what should be done, shouldn't be done. And he basically tells them what? And I'm not just so I can move into lesson 14. Well, only if you what? No, but only with a stipulation of that. Only if you own land. He does not restrict, if I read it right and understand it right, he did not restrict what tribe you could marry into unless you were a property owner. Because that's the only conflict or problem that exists. I'll come back to that briefly on Sunday. But I believe he restricts it only to those who are in this situation. If you're in this situation, then marry folks of your own family lineage in that tribe so that the land can stay there and we won't have these issues. But I do not believe he put that restriction on everybody. I'll go back and look and make sure. But and I'll talk 2 minutes of that on Sunday morning. Yeah, go ahead.